Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Thomas More's Utopia. Sir Thomas More, or Saint Thomas More, however you might know him, or terrible treasonous traitor Thomas More if you're an Anglican, I suppose. But Thomas More wrote Utopia back in the early 1500s, and we passed its 500th anniversary in 2016. I think it was published in 1516, so it's an enduring work, and this was the first time I came back to this book since my late teenage years. I think I must have read this when I was 19 or 20, and now a couple decades on, I've learned a lot more about life, and I've read a lot of dystopian novels. It's one of actually my favorite genres, and you have to realize that all of those pay an homage to Thomas More's book, because he's the one who originally proposed this idea of Utopia or Utopia. So if you follow along with the Greek wordplay, Utopia, good place, or Utopia, no place, that he's proposing this idea for you that maybe this good place doesn't exist. Some have said it's also possibly the lost island of Atlantis. But what's fun about this work is it's part political tract, so he's definitely trying to make the case for what does it mean to have an ideal society, precisely. It's also a bit of a travel log, because Raphael Hifliday, the person who's telling you about Utopia, has some of the same tone as you would find in some travel writing. And keep in mind, travel writing's quite new. 1492 is only a few years, some years before, and the entire idea of a new world existing beyond Europe's borders is starting to play larger in the minds of thinking Europeans. But it's also, in its own sense, a novel. So something that stands out for me among books that I love is they tend to cross different genres and fail to fit into something precisely. So yes, it's part political tract, it's part travel log, but it's also part novel, speculative fiction. The first of the utopian novels, ideas, tracks that are put forward. So it's divided into two parts. So part one is a subtle critique, not subtle critique, of English government at the time. So you're looking at the problems of enclosure. So wealthy landowners were enclosing land. Now, if you understand how medieval Europe, much less medieval England, worked, there were these large common areas where you could graze your cattle, or you could use it to grow things. If it was not enclosed, it could be used in common. And what was happening was enclosure meant putting fences up and cutting off the sources of fuel to gather wood, or grazing for animals, or living for people. And as such, it was causing widespread poverty. And with the double problem that would come later, which is the people who would take care of the poor and the indigent were the monasteries. The monasteries had food, it had land, they had places for these people to stay. But when you confiscate all the wealth of the monasteries, as Henry VIII would later do after he's chopped off Thomas More's head, as well as others, then these people have nowhere to go, and they start to cause problems, understandably, when they've had those sorts of problems themselves. So there's a critique of enclosure within this first part. There's also the critique of very rough punishment for thieves, the death penalty. This is argued that this is a terrible idea, not the death penalty specifically, but the idea that the punishment does not fit the crime. And it goes into a larger speculation as to how do thieves get there in the first place. And this points back to some problems that you would have if you have enclosures, and in a sense creating poverty where there wasn't poverty before. It also asks the question of who advises the king. How do you advise the king? Can a philosopher king continue to exist within his counselors, you could say? If he doesn't do it, can his counselors offer that to him? And the book's clearly informed by The Prince, by Machiavelli, which had come out, I think, 3 years before this. And by the Republic by Plato, which had come out thousands of years before this. But both of them are talking about how a king might rule. And the more, if you've read either of those texts, I think definitely if you haven't read Machiavelli's The Prince, I think you would do well to read it before this. If not, read it right after. But you'll see the ideas working together in tandem. Not that More is a fan of Machiavelli, but that he's clearly read Machiavelli, and Utopia is informed by some of the propositions that Machiavelli puts forward. As far as the Republic, the entire idea of this philosopher king, or the idea of an informed and virtuous populace that undergirds not just Utopia, but experiments like the American government as well. So that's part one. Part two then gets us into the ideas of Utopia. And here, what I found interesting, which I didn't know in 1999, 2000, when I read this book for the first time, because I know a lot more about St. Thomas More's life now, because I've read about it and I've studied him, that there is clearly a distance between his own personal beliefs and actions and what he's putting forward in Utopia. And what I find wonderful about that is this also freed me up to have a bit more fun. And when I say fun, I mean allow myself to consider ideas that I would normally be opposed to, whatever that might mean. And so if I think about that in terms of what More is offering us, then I see that he was able to speculate. So, for example, he puts forward this idea that in Utopia there's religious liberty. So there's people who worship the sun, there's people who worship the moon, there's Christians, there's all sorts of people, but there's no state religion. Well, he was clearly a proponent of the state religion, and when he was chancellor, he made sure that the standard Catholic practice around heresy was enforced at this time, which was, if you were a heretic and you dissented from church teaching, you were given the opportunity to continue to believe that yourself. But if you wanted to go out and preach about it and publish books and were obstinate about it, then you could be handed over to the state for punishment, and the state could choose to execute you, often by burning. And this was supposed to be a deterrent. Whether it worked or not, that's a different story. But this isn't a church teaching. There's no church teaching that heretics are supposed to be burned at the stake. This was just a measure that some of the countries decided to take on their own. And so here in Utopia, there's religious liberty. Thomas More the man, Thomas More the saint, didn't believe in that same kind of religious liberty. However, he does make some compelling points, which I think are still in consonance with his idea of tolerance, you could say, versus what was the standard practice at the time. And this surely he thought a very unmeet and foolish thing, and a point of arrogant presumption, to compel all other, by violence and threatenings, to agree to the same that thou believest to be true. I think that's 100% correct. This is on page 122 of the Everyman Library edition of the book. But the idea that you would force somebody to think the way that you do, that's a crazy idea. And this goes back to that idea of what is the difference between the religious liberty that we see today, which is this crazy idea that all religions are equal. Basically, that devil worship is the same as helping homeless people, that it's all the same thing. That's the religious liberty that we see today versus this time period, which was a tolerance for beliefs, and that it's silly to try to persuade someone by violence towards your ideas. And that's the entire exercise of a book like Utopia. Put forward ideas, think through them, and see how they play out against the society that you're currently building for yourself, the society that you have the ability to have some contribution to it. And that's where I say I had a bit more fun, and I see where More was having fun, is he allowed himself to speculatively enter a universe in which the rules were not the same as his current universe, and explain, why do I believe this, why do I believe that? And if you allow yourself to have that same fun that More did, and get into this universe and think about the different ways, and don't resist the ideas as you're reading about them. You're like, oh, that's a crazy idea, or that's a strange idea. Just let yourself be in Utopia and think through, well, why is he reasoning this way? What could we do in a limited way in the world we live in? And if you've seen me in these reviews before, you'll hear that I tend to focus on limited local action. That this is where we can make the most difference. The idea of changing the world, that doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen in one movement. It happens by lots of different people making movements on their own. So some of the strange ideas for his time period that are introduced in part 2 include women working, a 6-hour workday, an elective monarchy. What else do we have? We have no money, everybody wearing the same clothing, most housing designs looking the same, and yet slavery still exists in Utopia for various reasons. Not only as a form of punishment, but also as was always the standard use of slavery during the majority of human existence, which was what you did with captives for Moore. Moore isn't arguing for the existence of slavery, I think, here, especially because there's an ability for people to move between being free to being slaves and being slaves to being free. So there wasn't this idea of racial slavery where people are consigned to a certain category of life forever. So the last thing I want to talk about is what is clear that comes forward. So as I said, there's things that are not consonant with Moore's beliefs and actions in life that come through the text, but there's stuff that is very consonant. So Moore was an ascetic. He wore a hair shirt. If you don't know what that is, it's a uncomfortable undergarment that scratches you all day and helps you practice penance, practice mortification. And in the book, you'll see a lot of that kind of spirit of Stoicism, that spirit of resignation to circumstance, and to realize that riches are of themselves not worth your time, not worth your attention. So let me take a look here. So this ends with, he calls pride a hellhound. And I doubt not, this is on page 136 of the Everyman edition, and I doubt not that either the respect of every man's private commodity, or else the authority of our Savior Christ, which for his great wisdom could not but know what were best, and for his inestimable goodness could not but counsel to that which he knew to be best, would have brought all the world long ago into the laws of this weal public, if it were not the one only beast, the princess and mother of all mischief, pride, doth withstand and let it. And of course, that's pointing back to original sin, the idea that pride is at the root of all sin, the idea that you know better than God, you know how to pursue your happiness better than God has laid it out for you, and what unhappiness arises. On page 135, the page before, therefore, when I consider and weigh in my mind all these commonwealths which nowadays anywhere do flourish, so God help me, I can perceive nothing but a certain conspiracy of rich men procuring their own commodities under the name and title of the Commonwealth. This is 1516 that he's writing this. And talking about the uselessness of money later on that same page, out of the which in all the desire of money with the use thereof is utterly secluded and banished, how great a heap of cares is cut away. So you'll see more of this ascetic thinking. Money is not that important, and in the pointing out of clothing, he also points out gold in Utopia is used to dress slaves, it's used for their chains, and it's used for their toilets. So the idea of cultural conditioning around things that are valuable, and something that I really loved, he points out things like what really matter, earth, air, water, these are free and abundant, but gold and silver and things that you have to go and mine, they're difficult, and you have to go into the earth to go get them. But there's an inversion of value, what's really important, the stuff that's all around you, the stuff that's free, and what's not so important, the things that we culturally attach value to that really don't matter in the end. and could just as easily be used for slavery as it is. And of course, there's a certain note there. If gold is used for slaves, that means we can be enslaved to gold. So I could go on and on about this. It's not long, you can see. It's maybe 120 pages, all in 140 pages with there's a wonderful introduction in this Everyman's Library edition. I think that's why I'm recommending it. But even if you don't get that and you just find a free edition on the internet, because it's not in copyright anymore, being 500 years old, you'll enjoy this. So strongly recommended. There'll be a link in the description for you to buy it on Bookshop if you'd like. But otherwise, if you'd like to support the channel, please hit the like button, subscribe. There's also a Patreon in the description below if you'd like to continue to support these book reviews or browse the channel and see other book reviews that I've done before. But until next time, enjoy your reading.